So there's, I have a history of activism, which I would consider to be activism within queer liberation, which goes back to the 70s. So from the kind of mid-70s on. So in the mid-70s, I was very involved in lesbian organizing. And by the late 70s, in feminist, lesbian feminist and feminist organizing, as well as organizing and activism along with gay men. So and also as a socialist. So I straddled the feminist movement, the sort of burgeoning autonomous lesbian movement, the gay movement, and I was also part of a socialist organization. So there were, my location was an interesting one in the sense of straddling those movements. So I was active with gay men around particular kinds of campaigns against the right, the rise of the right in the late 70s in Toronto, the visit of Anita Bryant as a for instance, the bath raids in '81, those kinds of things, but defense of the body politic. But at the same time, I was also involved in autonomous lesbian organizing through the Lesbian Organization of Toronto. From 76, 77 on, in 79, we organized a binational lesbian conference that was held at Hart House, which had just recently become co-ed at U of T. In '81, helped to organize and found the Lesbians Against the Right, which in '81 had the first Dyke March in Toronto, 300 of us marching down Yonge Street and stopping at various landmarks that were significant to lesbians, both historically as well as in the contemporary context. I was also involved in the feminist movement in organizing International Women's Day and in a socialist feminist organization at that point, as well as in a revolutionary socialist organization on its own. So that's basically, I mean, those were sort of a lot of my activities, my activism within the queer liberation movement crossed over between autonomous lesbian organizing alongside radical gay men, and also organizing among socialist feminists and bringing lesbian issues to that context as well.
Great. That's quite a mix, an intersection of different
yeah.
movements and stuff. That's good. Can you share with us experiences you've had, this could be activist, academic, artistic, that you've had that you think are significant to how we think about queer liberation in theory or practice?
I think that for me, some of the most important moments, and this might get into the issue of pivotal moments as well within our movement, had to do with the ways in which the context of our oppression went beyond just thinking about us in narrow ways about what queer liberation or gay liberation was about, so that it recognized that we worked alongside, that we were among ourselves diverse, and that we weren't just a very normalized notion of a white gay man who's middle class and possibly Christian, but that in fact our movement was much more diverse than that. Even at an earlier point, and certainly now, we can't even speak of those sort of normalizing categories have, for my purposes, been blown out of the water for years. But I hope that we can build something that is actually inclusive in real ways of real life experiences and different ways in which people are marginalized and oppressed in our society. So I think for me it was things like, when the bath raids happened, the black community was also fighting against the racist practices of the police. And there was a particular shooting that had happened, a man named Albert Johnson, I remember his widow, Lamona Johnson, speaking at 52 Division down at Dundas University at a demonstration where we were also saying no more shit to the cops, no more bath raids, no more harassment from, because we're gay. And so there was a sense in which we had a common purpose. We had a common enemy, and we needed to unite. And I don't mean just unite among different movements. I mean recognize that this was all part of where we were headed as a movement. And to be able to integrate a sort of intersectional analysis of who we were and what queer liberation, or at that point, lesbian and gay liberation was about. So to me, that's one of the things I think in those early days that was important. I'm not saying that was represented throughout the movement, because I know I experienced an Anita Bryant demonstration where I felt that there was a degree of sexism that was exhibited based on the fact that she was a woman, and sort of a degrading kind of notion about her as I certainly wanted to have as strong a critique of where she was coming from as a right-wing Christian fundamentalist, and extraordinarily homophobic, and her message was, carried across the United States and Canada. But I certainly also did not want to see that critique embodied a particular kind of misogyny either. So, it's complicated. It's complicated to build movements that actually are inclusive of an anti-oppression framework. But I think there were parts of that movement, but there were parts of that movement, parts of our movement in the 70s and 80s that did embody some of that, a really anti-oppression framework. And that was certainly the basis of, as far as I understood, where I was coming from, and I felt that was the core of the lesbian and gay liberation movement in its birth or rebirth in the late 60s and 70s.
That's good. How would you define your role in queer?
My role now, I really feel, is as a teacher. I teach in a high school, so I'm an educator. I educate students and I educate teachers. I sit on a committee that helps to engender, create spaces for conversations to happen, to push activism of teachers around gender and sexuality issues in our schools forward. I don't know if that sentence made sense, but we're trying to bring together teachers so that they can have conversations, so that policy, which is great, we have great policy in our high schools, Toronto District School Board. We have great policy, but it's not implemented. And specifically critical sexuality and gender education, and ways in which that should be integrated into all of our curriculum as teachers. And so we try to make space for teachers to be able to come together to figure out a way to push those conversations and that work forward within schools, within public schools, both elementary and secondary. So there's that piece. And then as a teacher in the classroom, I'm out. I raise queer issues. That my, posters are up in the classroom. We have conversations, both formal conversations within the classroom, but also more, conversations you have in passing with students about particular issues. I just had a conversation the other day. Students were doing the student census for the Toronto District School Board Research Department. I hadn't done it with them. They're not my home forum class, but they were sitting around my sweet grade 9 art class. And 4 girls sitting up at the front, 1 East Asian, 2 South Asian, 1 Anglo-Canadian, said, "Miss, what's queer?" And I said, "Oh, are you, how did that come up? How did that come up? I'm curious." And they said, "Oh, it was on the student census that we just completed today." And I said, "Oh, well, what do you think it means?" And they said, well, they weren't sure. And then one of them spoke up and said, "Well, I think it means not obedient." And I said, well, that's interesting that you would say that. Do you think it has something to do with sexuality? And they said, well, they thought so because it was in that question about, and there were other kinds of things in that question that had to do with like bisexuality and other things. So they figured it was about sexuality. And I said, well, to an extent, I mean, saying not obedient for queer is actually very, very interesting point that you're making. And queer can mean lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, intersex. I said, what's intersex? So I explained what intersex was. But I said, and somebody who identifies himself as queer could be any of those things. But really, in some ways, they're not obedient. You're right. They're not obedient to the norm, right? And what would the norm be, I said. And they said, well, straight. And then they said, oh, yeah, that was on there, too. It was the question about heterosexual. And one of them said, I had no idea what that was. But then in parentheses, it said straight. And I said, oh, okay, I guess that's what heterosexual means. So I thought, here are these kids, they're like 14 years old, these 4 girls that sit together and they seem to be friends. I don't think they were in middle school together, but they've created friendship in this classroom, sitting together and doing their art. And I was so struck by how they first didn't know queer, really, as a sexual category or an identity category very well. Although this notion of not obedient I thought was very interesting. And she couldn't really say where she'd gotten that from. And then secondly, they had no idea of this category of heterosexual either. Now, they're clearly not girls who are, at this point, interested in identifying themselves in a sexual way, whereas there might be other girls in the class who might be in that situation. Where they are more identifying themselves in a sexual way. But I thought, how interesting that they didn't know these categories. So for me, I feel like my work is less internal to the movement, but more external. Like I'm out in a school, and I'm out there working with teachers. And certainly the teachers I work with do know the category of queer and heterosexual, but I think that they often don't necessarily know how to work with either queer students, how to support them in school, how to create a positive and inclusive school and environment for queer students, but they also, we need to broaden out our notions of sexuality and how we educate our students around sexuality and their sexual sovereignty, right, which is really what it's, I think a lot of it, base what it's about, that they can have sexual sovereignty. So I just found it very instructive and an interesting story. And they're talking with me about this, and other students are going on, and somebody else got involved in the discussion as well. Yeah, I didn't understand what queer was either, and so it was interesting. And then I said, there's the posters right behind you. They were sitting right in front of the posters that say, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, transgender, and queer positive space with the rainbow triangle. And then there was another homophobia-free zone poster as well. And so they could sort of look at those and say, oh, yeah, right. It was an interesting discussion.
And is this a contrast to what you saw as your role in the past? You talk about currently this is your role. Do you see?
I've been teaching for 13 years. I'd say my role previously was I saw much more as an activist within a community where there were certain, like everybody would understand what the words were, what the terms of reference were. So yes, I think that there is something different in that. So I'm sort of feel like I'm trying to take the message out, trying to figure out how to take it into my classroom every day in whatever way. But it's not like I only talk about queer issues in my classroom. I've talked with all my students about the Occupy movement. I talked with them about anti-racism. I talked with them about the victories that have been won in my lifetime. I talked to them about how I marched for civil rights as I grew up in New York, and I was marching at the age of 11. Within the black, as an ally to the black civil rights movement. I talk to them about how the struggle for racism is ongoing. I talk to them about feminism. I talk to them, it's been interesting to talk to them about the Occupy movement because it's been so much in the media that they have heard little bits and pieces. So it's been interesting to hear what they have to say. And they're definitely, it's kind of struck a chord in their imagination. Just the fact that people have been camping out in a park is interesting to them. That they would choose not to be, have a roof under their head, but a tent is interesting for them to think about because they're mostly pretty comfortable, I would say. Obviously, they go from living in a high-rise apartment to living in a house, and there's certainly varying levels of socioeconomic comfort and privilege, but none of them are living in a tent, so that's kind of fascinating for them. But also just the demands, like this notion that we need to overthrow capitalism and sort of like ways in which they, when thinking about the disparity between the rich and the poor and whether or not the rich actually deserve to be rich. Well, then they earn it because they work really hard, and getting into those kinds of conversations, trying to take apart and deconstruct some of the kind of ways in which this notion of rich and poor gets normalized, and certainly people who have privilege and power in our society or have privilege, the sort of normalizing narrative of, they have power because, they work hard and because they're, they deserve it, as opposed to there being some fundamental inequality in our society. So that creates, out of that, this incredible disparity between rich and poor. So it's interesting to engage with them. And of course, I find varying levels depending on how old my students are, depending on what I'm teaching them, the course, and that sort of thing, as to how they respond. But I engage them in all of those kinds of conversations as much as possible. And every once in a while, I have a student who says, "Miss, what does this have to do with photography?" And I'll say, "That's everything to do with photography. There's photographers out there that are photographing movements that are arising from the streets, and there are photographers out there that are creating new images that will inspire people, or there's people who are documenting all sorts of things happening in our society." That's one of the things that's so amazing about photography, that it gives people those tools. It's a democratic tool. It can be used in that way. So then they sort of say, "Oh, yeah, maybe."
Right. How would you define queer liberation?
Queer liberation is liberation for all of us. Queer liberation is about sexual liberation. It's about liberation from gender binaries. It's liberation from masculine, normative notions of masculinity and femininity. It's about liberation from heteronormativity. But you can't have all those liberations. You can't have sexual liberation. You can't have liberation from gender binaries. You can't have any of that unless you have liberation of everybody. And I was thinking about that. I was thinking about, there was a collective in 1978 of black women in the US. Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith were two of the women involved. I think Cheryl Clark, a number of other people who went on to do a lot of writing and who were very influential in the black feminist movement in the US and in Canada. And they had a collective called the Combahee River Collective, which was named after a particular river in South Carolina that Harriet Tubman had. There was an action that she was involved in at that particular river. They wanted to name it after something that had some resonance for the anti-slavery movement in the US. And in their statement, one of the things they said was that black women will be liberated. When black women are liberated, that means everybody will be liberated. And I sort of feel like when queer people are liberated, that means that everybody will be liberated. It's all bound up together. I don't think there's any such thing as queer liberation without women being liberated, without there being an end to racism, without there being an end to a system based on profit which commodifies us, you know, without being told that if we drink Coke, we're going to change the world, or, you know, like those kinds. I think that there's a real, you know, we're bound, our liberation is bound up with the liberation of other people's. And I don't see it as a separate thing. However, that being said, that doesn't mean that we don't need to fight for a specific queer understanding of what it means to have sexual sovereignty, to have gender sovereignty, to actually make those choices freely in our lives without harassment, without reprisals, without denial, without erasure, fully knowing our history, embracing that history, not just tolerating things and accepting things, but actually celebrating and embracing sexual and gender diversity. That has to be central to a movement of liberation. And if it isn't, then it's not a movement, and we won't dance at that party.
And this is related to what you choose to relate it to, and that is how is queer liberation expressed in your activism, in your art, in theory, whatever you want to connect that to in your life.
I think how queer liberation is expressed in my activism is that I'm very, you know, I've been out from like many years, but you know, it's always about how to kind of negotiate that to sort of make the best political kind of splash out of it, whether it's with my colleagues or with my students, or like sort of how to use it as a way of opening up conversation. And pushing. So I guess that in a lot of ways. And I don't necessarily see that as an artist, that my work is necessarily queer focused, but I think again, I'm trying to open up conversations. My latest, I did a video about my father and his loss of memory called In Living Memory. And in it, I'm out as a lesbian, and I talk about coming out to my parents, and my father, both my parents were communists, you know, through the 30s, 40s, and 50s and beyond in the U.S., and were surveilled, spied on by the FBI, and you know, it was quite a time for them and for me and my sister. But when I came out to them, my father's response was, and I say this in the film, you know, that's fine with me as long as you're happy. I know a lot of communists who are lesbians. So he was kind of welcoming me into the fold. My mother's response was, oh, you know, I should have never let you go to Canada, move to Canada, because there aren't enough men there. So obviously she felt that I had abandoned her. My father was welcoming me into the fold. My mother was feeling abandoned because I was, in quotes, giving up the struggle with men. Which I, you know, told her, like, that's not what I was giving up at all. I just wasn't having sex with them. Or wasn't interested in having sex with them. So it was an interesting moment. Anyway, so while that's there, I don't think that necessarily in that video, In Living Memory, that I made in '97, my work as an artist isn't really queer focused, although I am openly who I am in the work. My latest work is called FBI Family, which is about it specifically addresses the surveillance of the FBI on my parents, and the images are layered images of the FBI file, my mother's FBI files, with family photos from the 50s. So, but it's not like you could look at that and you wouldn't necessarily know that I was queer looking at that work. But I think for me, if I can do something which I'm not always sure that is a good thing to do, if I could open up that space of what queer means, which is about opening up conversations that are not normative, that's probably something that work does, or I hope it does. Okay.
that you had chosen.
Okay.
And you chose 3 in the category of history. And the first is, did the gay liberation movement borrow from other movements? And if so, which movements and how?
I think it borrowed from a number of movements. I think it certainly borrowed from the feminist movement, and I think it also borrowed from the socialist movement, or from socialists who were active. I think it also borrowed from the civil rights movement. So I think for each of those there were probably different things that were integrated into the movement. Now, that being said, I think that now, but I think it's true back through history, the movement was never monolithic. So it's a bit difficult to talk about the movement in that sense. It wasn't monolithic politically in terms of what its perspective was, but it was also not monolithic in terms of the different players and different ways in which people's identities were represented within the movement. So there's always been that kind of how does it balance out in terms of how in what we would call in the past gay men or lesbians, like in the 70s and 80s, what was that balance in terms of how their voices were represented within the movement, and also in terms of race politics, how that was represented, how that was included or not in the movement, and then overall in terms of feminism and some issues around socialism and how much we critique the society in which we're living and what we think is the remedy for our liberation, what's that vision of. So having said that, in terms of what I think some of the dividing lines have been, I think that there's, in terms of the way in which the movement, what it took from feminism was, or at least what part of that movement took from feminism, was a radical critique of gender roles and the way in which manifestations of hatred, discrimination, and oppression of gay people was so intimately connected to very strict normative roles around gender. And also the family structure and the structure, ways in which the state in a capitalist society reinforces those gender roles, those strict gender roles, and also the way in which they're manifested within the family. So I think that that's a lot of what kind of got taken up into the movement. Now, it wasn't taken up necessarily into the movement for all time, and it also at some point became at some point it might have been a more majority current within the movement, and then it might become a little bit more of a minority current where you get a more rights-based kind of approach that takes over with a less radical critique of the society in which we're activists, in which we're living. So I think that was the piece in terms of the feminist movement. I think the socialists brought as well another radical critique of the society as a whole, and the way in which sexual and liberation is tied to the liberation of all people, and particularly, we work, and so there's a whole connection to unions that I think was very important and it still is. I'm quite taken with and amazed with the role that lesbians have played within the union movement, within the labor movement in Canada, in pushing forward a lot of really important gains that have been won around gender and sexual issues, sexual orientation, protection, a lot of issues within unions in Canada. And that was, from a lot of the sort of autonomous lesbian organizing and organizing within the feminist movement that then went into the labor movement and, out in that way. Anyway, I don't know that I feel like I'm a little bit off track here in terms of an answer to your question. But I do think that there was a real influence of those movements on the gay liberation movement, on certain parts of that gay liberation movement.
And what would you say are the most pivotal moments in our histories? What can we learn from them?
Pivotal moments, you know, it was interesting. I was thinking about what those pivotal moments were. I mean, I would say that bath rates were a pivotal moment. I would say that they were a pivotal moment because it was very clear that even if you didn't go to the bathroom, I mean, I didn't go to the baths, right? It didn't matter. It was about an attack by, you know, agents of the state, right? It was about normative behavior. It was about trying to enforce. It was policing. It was about sexual regulation, right? It was so clear. And it was a pivotal moment because it also connected activists with a community of people who wouldn't necessarily have been out in the streets. So it was pivotal because, I mean, it was big. It was big. It was a moment of building a movement building moment. You know, that was taken, which was, I think, advantaged in important ways. So there were people involved in that struggle through the Right to Privacy Committee, but also in certain other, you know, manifestations within the community that, you know, as I said, like they would not necessarily have seen themselves as activists or as anybody who would come out in you know, for their liberation. So I think that was a really pivotal moment. I think that Men Loving Boys Loving Men was a pivotal moment. You know, the publishing of that piece by the Body Politic, I think that it created fissures and tensions with lesbians. I think it created, but it also opened up spaces. But then I think, and again, the attack by the state on the Body Politic kind of pulled people together. I think that there was a way in which people put aside their differences, recognizing how important it was. And that's important, right? Like, because we're not always gonna, when we're working in coalition, which, I mean, our movement is always, in some sense, as a coalition, we need to be able to be clear about what our bottom line is and that we're not always gonna get everything that we want. So in that situation, yeah, I know that there were lesbians who really did not agree with that article, that felt that there was a way in which issues of sexual sovereignty and sexual self-determination for women were somehow being dismissed in some of the kinds of discussions that happened around about intergenerational relationships and intergenerational sex between men, that somehow some piece of feminism wasn't being integrated or acknowledged. I see it very differently than how I saw it then now. Like but nevertheless, I think that there were, but the question is, like, once the body politic is attacked, then what do, right? You go, you lend your voice, you speak out, so I think that there were lesbians who did that, despite their difficulty and sense of not quite worked out about this, not feeling that necessarily their voices were always being heard. In the movement, when you're under attack, you need to make some of those kinds of choices. So I think that, but within, you know, what I was doing in terms of the International Women's Day Committee, which was a socialist feminist organization, we were trying to integrate lesbian issues into International Women's Day, into the feminist movement. And International Women's Day in those days was it still is a big event, but it was it was very big. It was really reflective of our movement in so many ways, and of the myriad manifestations of our movement. And I think that that was, that happened in the early, 82, 83, 84 period of time. And then from 85 on, there was also an integration of anti-racist politics within the feminist movement, challenges to, white feminists around race. I think those were all really pivotal to queer liberation. The foundation of Lesbians Against the Right in '81 and the Dykes in the Street March, I think were also really pivotal moments. The pivotal moments that reflect, that are more in the public sphere or in the public eye or have much more of a public visible presence in our movement's history are things that have more to do with gay men, and which is a complicated, as to why that is. Does it have to do with, the state and who it attacks? Yes. Does it have to do with how we organize? Yes. Yes, there was the attack on the Pussy Palace, which involved lesbians at a later time. So, you could say that was a public, visible, similar kind of situation to the attack on the bath, right? On the baths in '81. It's interesting to think about those pivotal moments. Certainly, I think that the winning of gay marriage was a pivotal moment. I'm not very positive about that pivotal moment, but I think it was pivotal, and I'm always constantly being trying to stretch myself to figure out ways to use it, because it's such an interesting moment. And it's still such an interesting conversation, because I reject gay marriage. I'm not married, and I don't want to get married. My partner's mother, whom I've been with my partner for 30 years, just celebrated our 30th anniversary. Her mother, I don't know, maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago, said, "Are you and Amy going to get married?" And Mo said no, and she said, "Well, that's good, because if you did, I wouldn't come." And when I heard that, I thought, okay, let's do it. But that was the only moment, because somehow in that moment it was transgressive, right? But that passed. And then another moment came with our son, who's just about to turn 17, where he wanted to know if we were going to get married once it was legal. And I said I really wasn't interested, and he said he wanted us to get married because he wanted to be a ring bearer. So he sort of had this kind of, he wanted some role in that. And I think obviously it meant also that he was going to be considered more normal. And once gay marriage was legal, he was getting teased because his parents weren't married, not just because his parents were lesbians, right? So it was like, oh yeah, just add on another thing to get teased about. And so to be harassed about, to be put down about. So, but I do find that it does open up conversations with people in ways that sometimes other things don't. But conversations that somehow feel like I'm being normalized. Like I'm like, oh, that's great, you have your rights to marry now, isn't that terrific? And I'm like, I don't really know if getting married is what I've been after all these years. It isn't actually. Thank you, but it does open up a conversation, and it does mean that there's the possibility that teacher in my high school who's teaching law might teach about same-sex marriage, and students might actually become more accepting or more tolerant. Whether they're going to embrace or celebrate sexual and gender diversity, I'm not sure. It depends on how far that conversation goes in the class. So it's a complicated issue. But I feel like our movement kind of got derailed by that kind of a rights focus. But it's here and it's now, and I'm not saying we should tear down everything all the rights that we've won. Obviously, we don't want to tear those rights down. We want to, but what kind of a society are we building? Not one where we're just like everybody else. Because everybody else is also not like everybody else. I mean, just the other day, I was having a conversation about a guy named Slavoj Zizek in a culture group that I'm a part of. And it's a kind of a queer group, but my partner and I, Mo and I, are the only, queer identified people. But they were talking about, whether you can reform capitalism or not, and talking about, how incredibly clever and how capitalism sort of co-opts everything, and how is it trying to co-opt the Occupy movement, and all these things that are very important conversations. It was a queer conversation, but really there were only two of us that were queer identified in that conversation, in that particular group. But I just feel like I've gotten off track in terms of where I was going. But I was just thinking about, how for me, legal rights are not unimportant, but they're not the end. They're not the vision. It's important. I don't want to deny the importance of particular kinds of legal rights. I can be out in my classroom because because I have, because there's an Ontario Human Rights Code, because there's, a Toronto District School Board policy which protects me, right? Because there's a Ministry of Education policy and, all those things. So those are important, because I can be out in the classroom and I can't be told that I can't do that, right? I can bring things to the classroom. I can bring speakers to my classroom and to the school. So all of those are important. I have same-sex benefits. I have a good dental, all those sorts of things. So, I'm not saying those aren't important, but for me, it's a deeper, there are more, those are things to build on. Those are things to try to leverage power and to be able to build activism around some deeper issues in our society.
Good. And I know that you have some questions that follow up on that as
Yeah.
well, so that's great. And then your last question that you chose under history is, were there elements the gay liberation movement developed as being uniquely its own?
Yeah, I think that it's about love and it's about play, playfulness. I think those two things have been central to our movement, and I think any movement without play, any activism without a playful spirit, without a spirit that pulls on the playfulness of each one of us as individuals, is a movement. If you don't do that, I think a movement just doesn't have the spirit, the longevity. It's also about building institutions, but I think that playful and love. I mean, I was remembering Evelyn Hooker, who was the psychologist in the U.S. who was responsible, well, not single-handedly, but who was very involved in the movement to decriminalize homosexuality, to take homosexuality out of the realm of being sick and deviant, etc., and did a study of gay men in which she showed them to be regular people just like anybody else. There's that documentary about Evelyn Hooker called Changing Our Minds, the story of Evelyn Hooker. And in it, she's giving a speech somewhere, and I've always been so moved by this. It's been years since I've seen it, but she says that something like, the gay community showed us all how to love. And I think that there's something about a movement which is about love, a movement which is it's about sexual love, it's about emotional love against all odds, in situations where you face great reprisals, where you face discrimination, where you face oppression, where you face being kicked out of your home by your parents, where you face derision, where you face harassment. There's something very powerful about that, and I think that's really what our movement has been so incredibly amazing at being able to do. We just need to do it in better ways, increasingly deepen our inclusive notions and vision of how we do that. Yes. Yeah. When I talk about our movement, I guess I mean it's queer. It's a queer liberation movement, which is inclusive. Yeah. Queer. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so
The word threaten is an interesting one. In what threatens queer liberation politics in the contemporary context. I wasn't sure if I wanted to rephrase that question as what challenges do we need to rise to, or in a lot of ways I think that one of the things that I feel is that we get stuck in a particular kind of ethnicized, it's identity politics that we get stuck in. And that, I think, is problematic. I think there's, and I guess give you an example. It's not so much that the queer liberation movement, it's sort of the way in which lesbian, gay liberation, queer liberation has trickled down in terms of policy. So at the, when I look at the Toronto District School Board policy around sexual orientation and teaching and learning around issues of sexuality, it's almost as if it's only LGBTQ people who have sexuality. It's not about sexual diversity. It's not about the range. It's not about teaching sexuality education in different ways, in a more inclusive and critical way. It's about ending harassment of people because they're LGBTQ. It's about creating positive spaces, but when somehow it's as if we're the only people who have sexuality, and that's a sort of a way in which you become ethnicized, you become an identity, and that's problematic, So I think that's one piece that's a problem. It's troubling. I think the other piece that's troubling is a way in which privileged gay people identify with and take their politics from their privilege and become racist, maybe like in the sense of anti-immigrant, or not understanding particular political forces at play. And so you get a particular, I know there's this notion of homo-nationalism that has arisen, particularly around gay people who might identify with anti-immigrant movements in Europe, but also in the US and in Canada, and also ways in which there's been a particular kind of pink washing of Israel, and therefore a particular way in which the notion that Israel as a, in quote, enlightened Western democracy, all of those are troubling categories, it is so good to its lesbian and gay people, Jewish people, Jewish, lesbian, and gay people, that and ways in which that doesn't take into account the fact that there's an occupation, that there's a structural situation there with the building of a so-called security wall, an apartheid wall, with the occupation, with the checkpoints. I mean, the fact that therefore that's put on one side, that there's this great, lesbian and gay life for citizens of Israel is distinguished from the fact that we know that in the Arab world, and in this case particularly among Palestinians, there is no rights, and if you're gay, you will be, you will be killed. Well, in fact, since the 1950s, there's been, homosexuality is legal, right, within, Palestinian society. That doesn't mean that it's been, that they've enjoyed, Palestinian gays have enjoyed great, rights. But there are 3 Palestinian queer organizations now in the contemporary situation who are struggling, and they're very active, and they have links with organizations around the world. So so I think that there's a split, there's a division within the queer liberation movement generally around some of these, and maybe it's between queer liberation and maybe lesbian and gay rights movement. Maybe we could sort of say that, so there's a rights-based thing. Well, we're just going to build our rights within our countries, wherever we are, and we might identify with the state and some of its campaigns against immigrants because we think that immigrants, not that I do, not that you do, but that I'm saying that, we, as a gay rights movement, we're thinking, well, we want to maintain our rights, and we don't want people coming here to this country who don't believe in our rights. And those people are immigrants, and we might identify them as from different places in the world, and we don't think they're good. We don't think they're good enough. That's an anti-immigrant, approach. That's a homo nationalist. You're relying on your race privilege and your class privilege when you talk about that. And you're also making monolithic these categories, right? It's as if to be gay, you mean you're white and gay, is also an interesting category. You're white and you're male and you're middle class. What does that mean that if you're black, that somehow there's no category or Muslim, right? I have Muslim gay students, but they're not, we don't, it's like there's no category, right? It's like to be Muslim, if you're a woman, you wear a hijab, you're very, you're compliant, you're female, you're very feminine, you're this and that. If you're a male, then you're masculine. We have these categories that need to be broken down, and there's a kind of racism to, the black to the notions that the black community is so racist, or the Arab community is so racist, or that's not true. Within it, I teach it. I've had Arab students who've been some of the best and most fervent supporters of the Anti-Homophobia Alliance at school, the club that we run. And they argue with other students that are from similar places to them as well as others. So there's a complicated, we need to complicate it, and we need to do it on the basis of understanding that when people are in racialized communities, they come to queerness in a different way. And we need to understand that journey when you're racialized, when you come from when you're trans and you're racialized, what combinations of oppressions that you face, and it's not a singular route. It's not just a trajectory like maybe those of us who do have white skin privilege or class privilege have experienced, and it's different, and we need to understand that in ways that and not just understand it. I don't mean just in your head understand it. I mean in your heart understand it. I mean integrate it into the politics, integrate it into the way you think about the world, the way you think about talking with students, or the way you think about writing, or who you work with.
That's good. And you've been touching upon this a few times, and this gives you an opportunity to go more in depth on it if you choose, or I feel like you've covered it, but the category of rights-based claims, controlling equality, is there a tension between the pursuit of legal rights and social rights?
I think there's a tension. An inevitable tension. I think that one of the things that I find so interesting is how, for me, in my context, as a teacher, I find that there are so many more rights than when I was growing up. When I was in high school, so I graduated in 1970, than now, a student who might be graduating in 2012. Think about that. That's 42 years. 42 years, big difference in terms of the kind of rights that queer people have. And yet, And yet, a queer student in my school, it is just, it's, and I don't mean my new school is unique. It's so hard. It is so hard to be out. Maybe in a more arts-based school, it might be a little easier, a smaller school, you know, an alternative school, whatever. But generally, in our schools, it is not easy to be out. There can be support in place. There can be teachers who are out. There can be an anti-homophobia alliance, or a gay-straight alliance, or a queer-straight alliance, or a, you know, smashing, you know, sexual and gender categories club, whatever it may be, right? Gender and sexual diversity. There can be that club. There can be posters up. There can be, and still, it's hard. It is very hard. I've had students who went on to university, and their first year at university, they're like, you know, part of the queer LGBTQ club in their university. In their first year at university, they become leaders in that club, and they're very powerful, you know, very strong individuals. But in high school, it's just, it was not an option to be out. And they would come and talk with me just one-on-one, or they would come to the Anti-Homophobia Alliance only if they happened to have my class just before it met, so that they could pretend they were just hanging out in the classroom, but not actually leaving a class and then coming into the classroom, which is identified as the, you know, the queer place. So those things are, you know, and so yeah, we have rights, but I do think that there are some, you know, it's like we haven't won, right? And that's because we don't have those deeper social rights, and because we still live in a society which, at its base, whether or not, you know, we may have, capitalism may have co-opted a particular kind of gay consumer, a gay client, a gay, you know, stereotype, a sort of, and normalized a particular piece. But that does not mean that our queer kids, our trans kids that are just really marginalized kids don't face really extreme situations where they are thinking about suicide, where they're feeling completely isolated. And that can happen in, as I said, in contexts where things are in place to provide them with support, and yet it is really hard to go to that place where the support is. So I think that, you know, based on my particular situation, that's where I see some of those tensions play out.
You mentioned earlier, I don't know if you want to, you don't have to elaborate on this a bit further, but you mentioned how queer liberation may be seen as more radical, progressive, and then there's also the LGBT movement that's more rights-based.
Mm-hmm.
And did you want to talk a little bit about that on this theme of rights?
Yeah.
Tensions?
I mean, it is a tension because, you know, what do you do? I guess maybe this is where I feel like some of the, I've been very inspired by the Occupy movement. And maybe that's because, you know, I sometimes call myself a leftover, right? In the sense that, you know, I was involved in the left and for many years and still consider myself that. But, you know, it's, you know, when you're a longtime activist, you're constantly looking for hope. I mean, obviously I'm an activist because I do have hope that things will change. And that maybe through some of what I do, I affect little bits of change. But and certainly it's not an individual thing. I mean, change is a collective process and working with people. And I grow through that, and I hope that, you know, that continues to grow a movement. And when I talk about movement now, I'm talking more generally of sort of progressive movements. But the Occupy movement has given me hope, and that partly it's because I don't think that it's necessarily perfect, and there are definitely issues that it needs to deal with in terms of an inclusive politic, but I do feel like some of this, the way it's messaging around the 1% and the 99% is so clear, and it's messaging around economic inequality and social injustice, and all of that is it's so poignant, it's so clear, and it has such resonance for so many. And for me, I guess the difference between rights-based and queer liberation is that queer liberation is more akin to the Occupy movement, in the sense that it has a broader vision, that it's not just about, we need this, this, and this, and this, and it's also not necessarily about demanding things from the state, because sometimes we get so much into what are we going to demand from the state? What are we going to demand from, what are our demands, right? Well, maybe sometimes we need to build it ourselves. And that's partly the other piece about the Occupy movement. And maybe that's a bit about also the way in which it's analogous in some respects to the queer liberation movement. We need to build it. Maybe we're building something ourselves. It's not just about saying, we need to make these demands, and if we get these demands, then we're going to be good, or we're going to be further along towards our liberation. And what I think the Occupy movement is really, in many ways, saying is we need to start these political conversations. This is about starting to build a movement which is democratic, which is based on democratic discussion and participation. And one of the problems with our political system is that we don't have that, right? People vote. But our voting system is so undemocratic. Really, is that where if that's where it begins and ends? Really, that's not democracy. But we do have a lot of rights, certainly in comparison to other countries, right? But those rights are curtailed, and I think that there's a way in which we. Slavoj Žižek he's this Slovenian philosopher who's spoke at the Occupy movement, and he said that there's somebody an East German who was sent off. He's a Slovenian, so former Yugoslavia. He was telling the story. An East German was sent off to Siberia, and he said, "I'm going to write you." He said to his friends, "I'm going to write you. And if I write in blue ink, it means it's true. And if I write in red ink, it means it isn't true, because I know it's going to be looked at by the censors." So he gets there, he writes a letter, and his friends get the letter back in East Germany, and the letter says, everything's good here, it's good food, I get great movies, everything's fine except for one thing. There's no red ink, there's no pens with red ink. And he says to the Occupy movement, he says, you're the red ink, right? You have so many rights here in the so-called West, but you also don't, right? And the red ink is about the unfreedom, right? And you are the red ink for this movement for change. And I think that's so powerful and maybe the queer liberation movement is that red ink in relation to the lesbian and gay rights movement, which is that we're really pointing out where, in the big picture, what our movement, what queer liberation is about. It's not just about winning rights legally. It's about a vision of sexual and gender diversity and sovereignty. And when we win those rights, we may be a little further along, but if you just focus on the rights, we're not going to get to the liberation. So the rights may be a good strategy to mobilize people, because it's harder to mobilize people around some of the larger issues, but you can never, I don't feel that you're going to get to the liberation by just focusing on the rights. And also not just focusing on rights for a particular portion of the population. We need to be connected to all those other peoples who are part of us that are fighting for their liberation.
Well said. And this takes us to the last category you've chosen, and that's intersectionality. questions here. What do you think of identity politics? Advantages, disadvantages?
Well, I think that identity politics was great at a period of time when we needed to, I could speak specifically as a lesbian, like, you know, my identity as a lesbian was very much influenced by the era of identity politics, and it was about coming together, you know, with a common sense of oppression, a common sense of what we were fighting, a common sense that we wanted to bring an understanding of heterosexism to both the gay movement as well as the feminist movement, a sense that we wanted to bring a sense of who we were as women and lesbians to the gay movement. Like, I think we really, we shored up and started to understand ourselves as lesbians through that identity politics. So I think it can be useful. It's a form of, it's solidarity, you have a common, a sense of commonality and a common struggle. Where it's problematic is because it tends to homogenize. So then, you know, you become, it homogenizes, everybody's the same, it's monolithic. So even in our categories around lesbian in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, it was too monolithic. It wasn't inclusive. There were lesbians that didn't. What was the common notion of what a lesbian was? You know, you wore, you know, work boots and jeans, and you didn't wear any jewelry, and you didn't wear a bra, and you wore, you know, plaid shirts. And I mean, I'm saying this is a stereotype, but I'm saying, like, there's a way in which that identity politics, you know, boiled down to some it was based on a lot of privilege. It was based on a particular kind of notion of a sort of counterculture that was really open to not a lot of people. So I think that identity politics can sometimes be exclusive as opposed to inclusive. I think that identity politics can also boil things down to an essence which isn't actually true or valuable. It can also lead to a particular kind of normalizing. A normalizing and an othering at the same time, right? It's sort of, you know, here we are, you know, here's our identity, and we can be like any other, we can take our place alongside, you know, the other nations. So I think it's got its advantages, but it's also got its definite disadvantages. I don't think that in terms of political mobilizing, I think that it has both as well.
And does proliferation intersect with other philosophical, social, or theoretical perspectives? We provide some examples. You might think of others, such things as politics of difference, anti-oppression, social justice.
I think that queer liberation, for me, is about anti-oppression. I mean, I use an anti-oppression framework in all of my work. There are a variety of, there are a range of oppressions that we face in our capitalist society and our capitalist patriarchal, you know, gender and heteronormative society, which is, you know, it has to do with race, it has to do with gender, it has to do with sexuality, it has to do with class, and it has to do with disability. And I think that all of those issues must be mobilized. And so for me, I think queer liberation is very much a part of and needs to have an anti-oppression framework. To be queer is to be black, is to be any other. It encompasses all. We are all of those things. We must fight to dispel this sort of notion of queer as white, male, middle class, able-bodied, privileged. again, I guess the queer liberation can learn a lot from critical race theory. I think in terms of ways in which we need to understand racialized peoples. What that process is about, how it operates, how, in fact, we need to, within our queer liberation movement, to think about racialization and break down some of those, I think, very normalizing notions of race that we have. I think that my sense is that when I was reading a piece in Extra about there was a meeting last night, Queer as Black Folk. I think it was held at Ryerson. I was wanting to go, but I didn't get there. And one of the things that they were trying to really discuss, investigate, examine is that when you're racialized, it's what that does in terms of a particular kind of solidarity you have with your community, and therefore the silences that exist around queerness, but how queerness is there, right? It's just expressed in different ways, and about how to try to address those silences. And I think queer liberation needs to take some of, to understand through critical race theory some of what that means, and how to embrace those parts of queer liberation that are racialized, and to embrace the differences that means in terms of how you're queer. In terms of socialism, I guess queer liberation has to understand, it takes from, what for me, the way in which queer liberation is connected to socialism is about a critique of capitalism, and understanding the ways in which capitalism is about sexual regulation as much as it's also about class regulation, as in gender regulation. It's about gender and sexual regulation by the state. So yes, we can win games, yes, we can win legal rights, yes, we can do, but really at base, we don't have sexual or gender liberation. And that's because that's not part of what capitalism is going to grant us, because capitalism is based on profit, because capitalism is based on using us as becoming commodities, or consumers, and so, and workers that are compliant. I think queer liberation can learn something from that in terms of the depth of its analysis. In other ways, I'm not sure it has a lot. I mean, I think that socialism has to reinvent itself. So there's a whole other piece there, because certainly one of the most disappointing things in the 20th century was the failure of socialism, failure of communism. It was probably one of the most hopeful and invigorating movements that at some points had critical mass, but was one of the most, maybe the most horrible and sorry and sad disappointments of the 20th century, that failure of that movement to really make change, and to, in fact, what it became was something that was pretty monstrous. And so there needs to be a real, so maybe alongside queer liberation, there also needs to be this kind of rethinking of what the commons, I guess I think about it as the commons, and try to use that language, and what the basis of the commons and moving forward is communism, but it's a different kind of communism than what we have ever known before. I think we've had moments of it, Paris Commune, 1871, or other moments of where there was democracy among the commons. Maybe there's a queer commons, or querying the commons. I didn't get down to the queer Occupy movement piece that happened, that I know numbers of people were involved in down when the Occupy Toronto was down at St. James Park, but I was very interested that was happening. I don't know if you got down there.
I wasn't able to myself.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, that takes us right to our last question for everyone. And that is, based on the questions that we've discussed, the discussion we've had, the conversation, if there's anything further you want to add, anything you get a chance to share.
I guess the only thing I didn't get an opportunity to touch on at all is myself as a parent, because that's an interesting, I think parenting as a queer person, as a lesbian, as a feminist, as a, all those, I feel like it both is very transgressive and very normative all at the same time. And that's an interesting process, because I'm out, and we're both out as our son's queer parents. It means you're out a lot, like you're constantly being out in school situations with teachers, administrators, all the rest of that. And there is something still transgressive about being a parent that isn't, being not heterosexual. But you also exist in this little family, and there's two parents, and there's one. There is a way in which it is also normative. Like, so when it's actually becomes normalized in the conversation or in the situation, it feels very normal in a funny kind of way. And so that grates on me sometimes. But on the other hand, I think it's also good for our son. I think that's good. Like, I think it's good that it's kind of normalized for him. He's got other challenges, and so I sort of think, he doesn't really need to be. I don't want to ask him to be transgressive. He can be as transgressive as he wants to be, or not. That's his thing. That's him. He's got to figure that one out. That's for him to figure out, and for him to go his way. So I just find it's an interesting. It is interesting. It is interesting building family, building queer family. For me, a lot about queer family is about it's not about building a nuclear family. It's about building links across families. It's about him having people that he considers family that he is not biologically related to at all. So, he's got two sisters that are his sisters because they're part of our created family, and he considers them his sisters. He's got people who are cousins who he considers cousins because he's designated them that way. So, yeah, I find, and there is a queer aspect to that, and he embraces that, as well as obviously we've tried to engender that in his life. But on the other hand, he's 17. He's dealing with his own issues around becoming a person in the world, and his own masculinity, and who he is, and all those things. And sometimes I'm not entirely sure how. I'm trying to negotiate all that with him. We are both trying to negotiate and help him and support him. And sometimes I'm not, it can be, sometimes I feel the things that come out of my mouth aren't necessarily that queer. and sometimes I think they're very queer, and it can be difficult. It's constantly kind of that negotiation. And there are a lot more parents in our communities, in our movements, and so I think that's an interesting question. You know, what are we creating in the next generation? He's certainly more open about talking about a lot of things, but he's interesting. He thinks that, he mentions queer people or gay people. You don't use the word gay more than queer. Gay people, like, you know, he has a girlfriend, and his girlfriend's mother has a friend who's now living with them who's gay. So he mentioned that he's gay, and I said, yeah, so, you know, like that was the most important thing about it. And he said, well, I thought you'd want to know, because, you know, I know that you gay people like to know when other people are gay. And he said, like, you know, like most of your friends are gay. And so I said, well, you know, what about so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so? And he said, oh, yeah, I know, but most of your friends are gay, right, aren't they? So he's got a very kind of nationalist kind of approach to it, and partly that's because he's trying to, I think, create his own identity, which is that he's not gay, in contradistinction to ours. And I'm a little bit more, I mean, I feel like we're a little bit more fluid than the way that he's setting it up, and that's interesting in and of itself, for us to be dialoguing with him around that. Like, we dialogue a lot with him around trans issues, and I find him to be just not very progressive and not very inclusive in ways that I think have to do with him working out some of his issues around masculinity. And I'm a bit, so that's a challenge. You know, that's another challenge, right? His girlfriend takes him on too, which is good. Around those issues and others. But yeah, parenting is definitely up there as a big a challenge, but also an incredible way of thinking about how these issues play themselves out in the everyday and in the concrete.
Good stuff. I appreciate that. Anything further?
No. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So my name is Amy Gottlieb. I live in Toronto. I identify as lesbian, feminist, socialist, queer activist, social justice activist. I'm a parent, and I teach in a high school in Toronto and have for the last 13 years. Is that good?
Okay.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you so much, Amy. I
You're welcome.
appreciate that.
You're welcome.